in my experience, the concept of rest and recovery is not that familiar for many people. I think it wasn't familiar for most of my life. If you become familiar with it, you should work to communicate it, work to develop it, help people to understand it, regardless of whether you are a formalized leader.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Human First Leadership Series. I'm Connor Drake, a senior coach at Mindmaven, and we're an executive coaching firm that helps startup leaders and VCs 10x their productivity and free up 12 or more hours a week by optimizing the way they work with their EA or chief of staff. More importantly, though, we then help them use that time to reach their fullest potential, to reach true greatness by investing into relationships. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Paul Meinshausen, co-founder and CEO of Aampe, an agentic infrastructure platform designed to help organizations better understand their audience and find powerful ways to optimize their messaging. In addition to that, Paul has a fascinating background in research, data science, working with places like Lockheed Martin, the US military, Harvard University. And I think we're going to get a chance to hear about how some of those experiences have shaped the way that you lead today, which I am thrilled about. Paul, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right. What do you say we dive in?
Let's do it.
So if I did my homework right, I think that I read that Aampe is a fully remote, fully distributed team across 10, 12 different countries.
Yeah, I think we're actually at 13 countries now. 13 countries, 5 US states. So fully distributed.
Oh, I love that. Fascinating. So we are obviously not quite at that scale, but we are a fully remote team here at Mindmaven. So I want to start there. I'm curious if you built Aampe that way because you think that is the right way to build a company in the modern day, or maybe said another way, do you have a strong stance for or against any of the working style, whether that's fully remote, fully in person, or some hybrid of the two?
I don't think the stance is so much important as the being able to be responsive to your situation. And when you're founding a company, it's a fairly unique situation in the sense that you can make a choice early on. For many businesses, it's sort of almost a moot point because if you're further along in the journey, it's pretty hard to diverge. So if you're a fully remote country in a lot of different places, it's very difficult to move. It would take a very intentional, effortful move to kind of bring people from many different places. So you'd have like a lot of handover to kind of rehire and centralize. And if you're a company that's really used to being in one place and everybody's already in the same city, et cetera, going remote can be difficult, although I think it's a lot less difficult. And in fact, feasible, but it will be difficult because you're transitioning practices and people are doing things in different ways. So in a sense, I think it's not that useful to have an opinion one way or the other. I think it's much more important to be responsive to your situation. When we started Aampe, it was 2020. It's right before the pandemic. The pandemic wasn't actually that central to the decision. What it was that I have always believed that you start companies around people, and the two people that I wanted to co-found the company with, and was sure that we were the right people to build this particular technology and business. One of them happened to be in Paris. The other happened to be in North Carolina. We knew each other very well, had worked together in different contexts in office and remote. So we had very deep relationships. In fact, one of them officiated my wedding, and back in 2014, we started working together straight out of grad school in the US for the Department of Defense in 2008. So we had a strong relationships, and we just knew we were going to do this together. And so it wasn't an issue. It was a sort of remote was fine. I'd worked at remote companies and believed that it was totally possible for us to do the job necessary. And then we continued to grow. Some folks joined us from my previous company in Mumbai and in different places, and that worked for us. But what it meant was we just had to be intentional about how we worked over time and built the company that we've built, and responsive to the challenges. Every format has challenges. Every format has pros and cons. And there are trade-offs, and you have to make the trade-offs that are right in the context of your objectives and constraints.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm fairly, I don't find a lot of the remote for or against, work from home for or against, in back to office trend. I don't find those to be so productive or useful because they're so out of context, because they're
Mm.
looking for like these simple generalizations and rules that just don't apply in a more complex reality, and end up just kind of wasting time.
I
Yeah.
respect that. Yeah. So it comes down to knowing your business and your people. I loved your statement around building a business around people. Not everyone has that luxury, but if you do, it makes a decision for you in a lot of ways. All right, let's shift gears a little bit then, talk more about your work histories. I was doing some digging before our conversation here, and you have an interesting spread. I think you've lived, worked, built companies in the US, like Singapore, India, you mentioned Mumbai. And I imagine every country has unique approaches to leadership, to company culture. And I'm curious if anything stands out from your time building, living, and working in these varied environments.
I'll extend what I said before, which is when you build a business around the conditions and constraints that you're operating within and the people that you've built the company around. And I'm speaking specifically in the context of startups where you're really
Mhm.
building the company around people. We can speak separately about what it's like to be at a larger company, and that process. I still think you're building it around people, but it's it's not as literal.
Really?
In that world, the broader country is a bit of a backdrop. The reality is today, we're pretty globalized. And so
Mhm.
everywhere I've worked has been, I mean, by definition, I either wasn't from there or in the US, it was full of people who weren't from there. Um, so, but even if you are from there, a lot of my early background research is in anthropology. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be from somewhere and what are the particular ways of being, et cetera. I think there's far more diversity, even in an apparently utterly homogeneous place than we give credit for.
Mm.
We're not really like each other in very many ways consistently. Um, you, this was like when I worked for the Department of Defense and deployed to Afghanistan, and I was mostly in Kabul, but I would get out into rural areas quite a bit because I was working with special forces unit that would deploy into villages, right? And there was so much effort and attempt to understand the context in which they were operating and the people in Afghanistan, and so much of it was flawed because it was based on this assumption that people are a particular way in Afghanistan.
Mm.
And then they'd realize, oh, that's not true. So they're a particular way in southern Afghanistan or Western Afghanistan, and then they'd find out that wasn't true. And it would go down into the valley level and be like, oh, it's because there are people are this way in a particular tribe. And there's these 3 different tribes in this valley. And then they found out that wasn't true. And it would be like, oh, right down to the kin network. And it's just not the case that most of the descriptors that we use to describe each other, nationality, language, gender, like most of those things aren't very useful in a precise way to predict our behavior or ways of being, et cetera. So I think in every place I built a business, it's been about understanding and being selective and choosing the people that you're working with specifically.
Mm.
That said, there is a context in which you operate, and that context does influence the broader perceptions of what's okay and what's not. So, for example, in India, a lot of tech companies reflect some of the broader hierarchies that seem to pertain and apply in society. Whereas in the US, there's far less of that, like open hierarchy. Even
Mm.
in the military, there was a lot of pressure to sort of be egalitarian or to kind of sort of think from the bottom. And so that led the backdrop of hierarchy could either facilitate or lead to behaviors within a company that might be counterproductive if you're striving for innovation or excellence. Um, but that said, it ends up affecting other things in different ways. So there's a element, for example, in Southeast Asia of politeness that is a backdrop. Doesn't mean that any particular person is polite, but that is an element to it, which has amazing qualities in terms of facilitating, respectful coexistence, but can also be counterproductive in the sense that it leads people to not really be blunt about the situation at hand. And so as you're building a company, you're running into lots of problems and situations. And if you're aware that, there's this backdrop, there's this context of politeness, that means people may not say what they're thinking or what they bluntly assess to be the problem that you're looking at. Then that's going to affect your ability to solve for it. So definitely there's this intricate landscape in the world, and the context matters. I would just say that you should also really be aware of the people themselves and not make too many assumptions or sort of stereotypes, because those end up just not being very predictive or productive.
I love that. At the end of the day, you're leading people, not stereotypes. Excellent. All right. You'd made a comment about deploying and being a part of smaller elite teams in the military while you were out there. Is there anything you can share, any, we'll say, leadership takeaways specifically that came from some of those interactions?
So it's actually remarkable how much the classic, or my preconception about leadership, something, by the way, that I had kind of rejected. I come from a military family. Two of my brothers went to the military academy in the US. My father went to the military academy in the US. So very familiar with the way of being and the way of working in the military. And when I was deciding to go to university, the academy was one of the choices, one of the options that I considered. I didn't do that. I ended up going to a public university. And then in that public university, I still considered it because it was such a strong way of thinking and a strong influence on my upbringing. And I remember just even trying out ROTC for a day and finding myself in a line and being told to stand at attention in a way that I just somehow in my gut rejected. I didn't like that hierarchy. But I had the perception that that was the way it was. So if you were in particular kinds of organizations, you needed it, et cetera. And so when I joined the Department of Defense after grad school, after doing a master's in Turkey, where I'd done my research, I was exposed to it again. And I was familiar as I deployed, et cetera. But when I ended up working with special forces, rank almost dissipated into the background. The thing that characterized, so I worked with these teams called Operational Detachment Alphas, ODAs, and they were 12 person teams. And every person is basically, they split the specialty. So every person has a specialty. It might be like really good at being a medic and knowing kind of how to deal with battlefield injuries, or you might be a weapons expert, or you could be a logistics supply expert. And there's established ways of breaking those expertises up, but everyone was really good at that. And everyone was extremely motivated and had a lot of agency. And that was reflected in even their ways of being. So they wouldn't, most of the military is like very straightforward. You dress a particular way, you're shaved. They wouldn't do that. Partly to reflect the context in which they were operating, being in a rural village, but also partly to reflect that it was their job to like be the best that they could be, independent of a lot of the physical appearance sort of things that the bigger military ascribed to. And leadership was sort of embedded within the team and the dynamics of people. It wasn't there was always a captain who was the lead for that ODA, but you didn't feel that captain's presence like everyone, yes, sir. I mean, it was just a lot more about the dynamic within the team that allowed the team to lead in a way that I found incredibly compelling. Later on, when I was doing research, I left the Department of Defense, went to do research in cognitive science and psychology. I was working quite a bit with a researcher and a professor called Richard Hackman, who did mostly small group dynamic psychology. So he would work with airplane pilot teams or surgeon teams, surgery teams, or military teams. But basically, tend to be small groups of people, small law firms, to kind of understand the dynamics of performance and how they operate. And it was really cool to sort of see some of those things that I'd seen with special forces, and see the theory and see the research behind how that mattered. And it ended up being that I realized that I wanted to spend a lot of my life in that context.
Mm.
And as you grow, things change. Of course, the context of a company changes, but I think even really powerful big companies still end up having a similar dynamic in terms of their ability to operationalize these smaller teams that can then operate within a broader team. And so to me, leadership is as much about the dynamics within people that are working together as it is embedded or embodied in one person who is the leader.
And I imagine to operate that way, a core foundation, something every team like that needs, is trust. You've got to trust the guy on your left, the guy on your right, the guy that is the captain, if you will, to be the best they can be. And they have to trust that you can be the best you can be, right?
Yeah, trust, absolutely trust. There's a performance baseline, and that affects that trust.
Mm.
But absolutely there's the trust. And trust is not something that's automatic. You can be the best in the world. You can go in front of the best surgeon in the world or the best dentist in the world, right? And when you sit down, you know they're the best, but you're still kind of afraid, right? You can sit in the backseat of an F1 driver driving a car, and as they drive at really high speeds, you're still going to be afraid. You still have to develop that ability to trust, despite the skill level. So it's absolutely both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I like that, balancing trust and skill. Now, before we officially started this here today, you and I were bantering back and forth a little bit. This topic of performance psychology came up. We were talking a little bit about that, and if it's all right, I'd love to shift gears to that side of things a little bit. I think it's a good segue. This idea of being really good at what you do, and you were sharing some stories in the past about sports psychology and the lessons you learned there that haven't always translated to business. Like, business is lagging behind some of what sports psychology has figured out. Do you mind sharing a little bit of your views on that?
Sports, let's say elite sports, elite performance, are another example of what I was describing with special forces. It's small
Mm.
groups of people who are all performing at the top of their game, where there's a lot of distributed responsibility across the team. An NBA basketball team has a captain, but you don't often think of the captain as the captain in the context of doing much. You realize it's just all a bunch of really good people. And yeah, they might circle around a particular person, and a person might be a great morale builder or flag holder or direction setter, but then somebody else is doing something else really important. And so that, I think is a really important example of how a certain set of people can get things done.
Mm.
And the thing that characterizes the progression in sports, and you can really know a progression. It's quite fantastic to just think about the way Babe Ruth played baseball versus how baseball is played today,
Mm.
or even how Michael Jordan played basketball versus how basketball is played by the best today. There's a clear progression to where oftentimes a main question would be, could that person even play today? Definitely we see it in running, right? The fastest people in the world in 1960 couldn't compete in the Olympics today. They're just not fast enough. The bar has been reset. And how has been reset? How have we, and it's a good example because it's basically the same measure. It's the same metric, right? They're running the same race. And that's important because in most areas of life, we don't have that comparability. It's very hard to sort of say, is a startup as good today as it was like in 1960 versus today? Because it's like, it's a different context, a different business. There's lots of different things that are harder to measure, but sports hold something constant, and you can see that the performance is improved.
Mm-hmm.
What's led it to improve? Well, you could sort of say it's a bundle of things. It's nutrition, it's physical fitness, but it's also practice, the intentionality of practice. How do you go about learning to swing a racket or, shoot a hoop? And there's a lot of deliberateness to that practice. And then there's deliberateness to the practice all around it. You take an ice bath. How do you kind of work on your sort of particular training regimen? Again, your nutrition, your psychology, the confidence that you have, how you work with imposter syndrome, anxiety, all of these things are incredibly important. And they're happening behind the scenes. I saw this, I was on YouTube the other day and I think I saw something and it was like LeBron James spends a couple of million a year on physical fitness, on his physical fitness regimen. Every elite athlete basically has a series of coaches and assistants and nutritionist specialists that are working around them to allow them to perform and to learn and to grow in their skill set. It's fantastic. In most of business, it doesn't see that hasn't translated as well. I think we're basically lagging in our understanding that in a business context, it's still a human trying to achieve a particular end, trying to solve a particular set of problems. And the problems are not as encapsulated. They're not as static or fixed as, let's say, the game of basketball. The game of basketball has evolved, but it's still roughly the same thing. It's a lot more heterogeneity and complexity in the work that you do as a technology company or any other kind of company. But at the center of it is still a human, still a person, and their mind and their physical body, which is determining a lot of their ability to solve the problem, their creativity, their ability to learn and grow. And I think we're starting to see it, right? Like it's a lot of I'm not as tuned into a lot of the podcasting around like I think it's Uberman or something. I'm aware of the backdrop of that. I don't follow as much of that, but I think it illustrates the point here more and more. And I see more of it in the Valley when I'm in SF. More people thinking about, how doing ice baths or meditation as techniques and tools. But I think we could see so much more of it. In fact, one of the things I often tell investors, venture capital investors, and I work within the context as an angel investor. I've invested in many startups as a founder, in many different contexts. But there's always been this, there's been this trend for investors to develop this platform of services that they can offer in addition to the capital they offer. So things like hiring, support. So they'll have a hiring specialist help you hire a VP of sales or whatever it is. There might be like an engineering advisor who will kind of help you diagnose your technical problems. There's usually sort of some kind of marketing advisor who will help you think about positioning and stuff like that. All the traditional things, and they've tried to build out this suite. What I see far less of is a kind of mindful, like a coach, not really necessarily therapy, but not necessarily executive coaching. I think there's a lot of work to just tune what the concept really even means, but that to kind of help people perform at a higher level, whether it's the founders, whether it's the founding team, whether it's with leaders or whoever it is within that early stage company. I think there's so much room for that practice and element to be pursued, and that the ROI of that would be, and is really huge. And again, I think the simplest example, it's not that I care so much about sports. I think it's just a very crystallized, simple example. And unfortunately, it's not familiar to most people. Most people, for example, where I grew up in Fort Knox in Kentucky, most of the time I was there. We moved around a bit, but most of there, this concept would be associated with something like therapy, and it would be you have a therapist because you have trouble, or because or something. It wasn't a tool that you thought, oh no, I can actively use this to become a better person, to become better at what I'm doing. Which again, I think is a shame. And I think we're making progress. I'm optimistic that more folks like yourself and Mindmaven and others, that it's just becoming more of a thing as humans that we can rely on. And the result will be improved productivity and better growth and everything else.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's maintenance, right? You're not going to get a car and never take it into the shop, never get an oil change. If you do that and it breaks down on the side of the road, it's not the car's fault.
I think it's maintenance, but I think it's a lot more than maintenance. I
Hmm.
think the
Okay.
point is it's high performance tuning. Your car,
Mm,
think of as maintenance. Maybe you get it checked up once a year or once every 2 years or something. I think that's actually a slightly older model. My point is an F1 driver is tuning their vehicle all the time. They do
mm,
research on it. They're optimizing the airflow, the drag and resistance, everything about it. It's a much more ever-present continuous process. Um, and I think there's room for performance tuning, calibration, not just
yeah.
let me fix something when it breaks.
Let's talk optimization then really quick. What's something that you've optimized for yourself, for your self-care?
You can kind of think of the dynamic of something that's happening. So in sports, you can think of like your shot and you work on your shot over and over again, or you work on your swing, right? And so
Mm,
you'll learn how to do your backhand or whatever. Um, Again, in the world of business where you're not playing a fixed game, it's harder to recognize that there are these strokes, these simple movements like a chord, but in life,
hmm.
it's harder to recognize them, but they are there. And it's really important to sort of, that's where you start. You start by breaking down, what are you doing? Like, what are those moments of creative work or something else? I think one useful framework that I've learned to think about is a sort of cycle between exertion, um, and recovery.
Hmm.
And you kind of exert energy and then you recover. So in physical fitness, you can go for a run and you run hard, and then you know you need to stop running, and you need to when you're done, you don't just keep running forever, right? You stop and you recover. You don't take a nap and then go for another run. You maybe wait a day, right? There's some regimen, some cycle there. And I think in most applications of work, you can find a similar cycle where you're about to give a talk, or you have a big meeting that you're preparing for, or sort of simplifying and chunking. Am I working on a set of, like, I'm pushing a code refactor and there's a particular module I'm going to work on. You find that chunk and you say, what am I doing in terms of where am I accelerating my effort? Where am I exerting energy? And then where am I recovering? How am I actively recovering? Because recovery is not a passive thing. It's an active thing that you can do really well. And if
Hmm.
you can work on that cycle and that loop, and then it's amazing how much you can put into that in terms of life, and you can live within those cycles, and you can work how you eat into that practice. You can work, rhythms across the course of a day, what your rhythm is in the morning versus an afternoon, and how does that correspond to when you're with your children, or when you need to make dinner in the evening. Whatever it is, you can build these rhythms and these cycles that help you tune those cycles and then improve.
Huh. So you mentioned this cycle of exertion and rest or recharging. And it's interesting. I'm curious from your perspective, you gather a high performing team, people who are very ambitious, very good at what they do. Do they naturally understand the importance of rest? Or is this something that as a leader, you need to push for and establish for them because they are naturally driven?
In my experience, the concept of rest and recovery is not that familiar for many people. I think it wasn't familiar for most of my life. If you become familiar with it, you should work to communicate it, work to develop it, help people to understand it, regardless of whether you are a formalized leader.
Hmm.
Again, I would almost push back. If we are having this conversation in the context of AMP, for example, I'd say being a leader has nothing to do with it. Being a member of the team has everything to do with it. You
Mm,
don't need to wait for a leader to kind of tell you what the right thing to do is. As a person, you are responsible for your performance, and you can push your performance forward by being aware of concepts that can help you. So I don't think so many people who have joined AM were not familiar with that concept. I didn't share it with them as a leader. I shared with them as a teammate. and I shared with them in the context of this is valuable for your life more broadly. AMP is just one part of productionizing it and utilizing it. And in fact, if you don't utilize it in your other contexts, it's very hard to then actually see its performance improvement in your work. Because as humans, we're pretty mixed. I think there's this flawed notion that you can kind of separate your work and then life, and then no, your mind is a very holistic instrument. It's your relationship with your partner or your children is intimately connected to your productivity in terms of your ability to write an email. It's relevant even more broadly than the work you do. But it's not a very familiar concept. Yeah. And it's something that there have been books that have informed my thinking on it that I will share, but also encourage people to kind of take the space to create their rhythms and their senses of, to think of themselves as like a high net worth, high elite athlete who their job is to figure out how to get the most out of themselves, not to conform to some routine. Right. So, in some sense, we all come together to play the game at certain points. Maybe we're on a call together or something like that, right? Like there's points where you come together, but then the rest of the time it's about you tuning your ability to come together. So again, basketball players, they play for that game. The rest of the time they're training and doing things. And sometimes they're training together, but sometimes they're really just focused on training themselves. And I think that again, pertains as well. And figuring out how you can rest and recover. Again, it's an active thing. It's definitely not a passive thing. And that's also a classic, I think, thing is that because people don't know how to do it well, they do it poorly, and then it gets a bad reputation. So you come home from a long day and you rest, and you think rest just means sit on the couch or open Netflix. Yeah. That's oftentimes counterproductive. It's not going to rest you. It's not going to help you recover. I'm not saying there's not room for Netflix. There's plenty of room for enjoyment and entertainment, et cetera. I think those are active parts of life, but they're not the best necessarily default way to recover from a particular series of mental exertions.
Would you be willing to give a little look inside what rest looks like for you, what one of your recharge tactics is?
Sure. I don't want to over theorize it, but I think there's a simple concept. There's this book called The Power of Full Engagement. It's written by 2 or 3 people, and they set up a performance center, I think in Florida. And they wrote this book based on their work with lots of athletes and different leaders and executives and things like that. But the main point of the book, if you kind of look through all the marketing speak and the business language, is that the fundamental unit that's important to calibrate is not time. We often think of time as like the scarce constraint we work against. And they posit that it's actually energy. Time is fixed for sure, but the value of 1 hour where you're really engaged and in flow is very different than an hour where you're just your mind is desiccated and dissipated. You don't know what you're doing. And so same unit of time, but very different value you get out of it. And the thing that you can control is that energy. And energy is, they kind of break it up into different kinds of energy. So it's not just this one singular thing. So there's intellectual or mental energy, there's emotional energy, there's spiritual energy, there's physical energy. So you can kind of look at the theory, but it's useful to break that up because you start to realize, okay, so when I'm working in these cycles of exertion and recovery, they're kind of independent or interdependent with each other. So for example, the way my day tends to be structured is that when I'm in Singapore, when I'm not on the road, I'm often on calls late at night after my 2 young ones are in bed. So usually around 9 to maybe 12, maybe sometimes I'll push to 1 a.m. so that I can be on a call with somebody in the US or in Europe. But I also will start the morning because oftentimes I'll have calls after I take them to school with calls with folks in California. But but that doesn't mean I'm working from early in the morning till late at night. I create breaks and I create kind of spaces in time. And one of those tends to be the late afternoon where I'm actively disconnecting from work. Now, the thing is, when you're working, you're mostly, let's say, at a desk, especially if you're a professional, right? You're at a desk, you're sending emails, you're doing kinds of works that are not physically taxing. You're not like lifting heavy loads or anything like that, right? So, but they're mentally taxing. You're concentrating, you're focusing, etc. And there's an interesting thing about the brain, which unlike it's a muscle like anything else in the body, but it doesn't have localized effects of exhaustion the way other. So when your arms get tired, you feel the pain in the arms. You can you can see the sweat. You know it. It's tired. But the brain doesn't have that capacity to sweat or have pain in the brain like in the muscle. And so what it just does is tell stories. It just reasons. And so when it gets tired, it just goes into like these sort of distorted reasoning patterns. And you start to kind of project things that you get tired, maybe you get sleepy, but maybe you just get depressed, maybe you get anxious. There's lots of different ways it might manifest across different people. Now, the thing is, a lot of times you come home from that mental exertion, you come from the context of I'm working really hard on this particular thing, and you need to recover. Okay, but here's the important point. You haven't physically exerted yourself. So you don't need to physically recover. You need to mentally recover. And there's a distinction that's really important. When you sit on the couch, you're physically recovering, but your mind again is not, it's still on a treadmill. It will still run. It will still spin. And if you give it a distraction, it might spin a little less. So it won't be spinning about work because you'll find a show that you're interested in, you watching the show. But it will, in the context of the show, it's still spinning because it's simulating the show and you're imagining the scenario, right? And mayyou're watching something about, the White Lotus just came out, right? And it's set in Thailand and it's beautiful, right? And you're spinning like, why am I not in Thailand? You're still doing a lot of work. But what's important is the exertion in one dimension of energy. The recovery happens by exerting in another dimension of energy. And so one of the things the last thing you want to do is go work out. You're like, I'm exhausted. I don't want to do that. It's really a trick because you're not physically exhausted. You didn't work hard all day. You didn't sweat. Your muscles aren't sore. If anything, what happens is if you don't exert energy, your ability to exert energy deteriorates. So it's kind of like when you go on vacation, you go to Spain for a year or something and you're not working. If you don't exert intellectual energy, you'll also deteriorate. That's why people go mad. They're away from the beach for a week and they're like, oh, I haven't worked. I haven't concentrated. I'm focused on something. Same with your physical body. So what I learned was that I needed to go for a run at that point. I needed to beat it out, like put my body under for physical exertion. And then when I come back, then I go into a rest period, a physical rest. And somehow that physical exertion gave my mind the space to rest that it didn't have in any other context. And it happens because of the endorphins and sort of the exertion on the physical side. I think there's certain aspects of that. It's the same thing applies in the context of emotional energy. The reason it's so important to spend time with your love, like even when you're in a startup, people think, oh, you got to ignore your family, you got to do work. It's not because other things matter or a lot of times it's like work-life balance. Oh, you need to spend time with your family. All of those things can be true, but what they don't realize is that actually it's also just important for your work because we have this source of emotional energy, and emotional energy is exerted through things like love and affection. So spending time with children or with a partner gives you this sense of exertion. You have to focus. Anybody who has children knows that you love them, but it can be exhausting. But it's a good exhaustion. That exhaustion is what is allowing your other forms of energy to recover. And then when you go back to work on Monday, if you really exhausted yourself with them, you're a lot more performant. Whereas when you sort of stretch through and you just continue to spin your intellectual wheels and do your emails, et cetera, and you didn't exhaust yourself emotionally, you've actually deteriorated your ability to kind of exert yourself intellectually again. So the point is that there's these interdependent cycles and types of energy. And if you're not aware of them, then you're not tuning them, which means you're not really performing on any one of them very well. So running is your kind of long-winded way to kind of wind back to your question. For me, running is really one really important way to do it. I do what are called meditation naps, which is a really important way for me. It's 15-minute increments, where I lay flat in a very particular pose and go into it with the intent to meditate, but with the acceptance of sleep. So it's not like meditation where you're trying not to sleep, you're trying to stay awake, stay aware. But it's under a timer, oftentimes with some kind of sound background. And at this point, I've done it for enough years that I will usually, because I know that really what I'm trying to do is sort of a non-sleep or a sleep meditation. It's sort of a mix, but the point is that I'm very tuned to it. So I will wake up about 1 minute before the timer goes off and come out of it. And it's but also my recovery in that 15-minute increment is really high. So I don't need to sleep for 2 hours, 15 minutes, and I come back really charged and full of energy. But it's a practice, right? That's like, as I was saying, like with tennis, you have a swing or a shot. You can create these practices, these small cycles of tuning that can be really performant. And then you can do them anywhere you are. I'll be at a big conference. I'm about to give a talk, right? And if I've got 30 minutes before, I can go find a simple space, lie down on the floor, and 15 minutes, and I come back, and I've been at the conference all day, but I'm back. You can find these things, these swings, and then you can put them into your daily life. And it's really powerful.
I love that. I think you hear all the time people say that, I can't nap. I used to be one of them, because to me, a nap was, okay, let me go carve out an hour and a half of my day, and I don't have time to do that. But if you can train your body to rest, you don't need a full REM cycle to rest, right? You give yourself that mental break, you come back, you get that mental rest, and you can tackle the rest of the day recharged.
Yeah, that's right.
God, there's so much more we could dig into. I want to be respectful of your time. You've given so much of it already. You've shared so many deeply tactical, I think, lessons for our listeners. So I want to thank you for coming on the show. I think this has been great.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun, and yeah, best wishes for everybody listening.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for everyone who listened, and stay tuned for the next episode.